Long before breaking news flashed across screens, before headlines shouted from radios or televisions, America's very first newspapers whispered their stories on fragile sheets of paper. They were small, uneven, and often printed in cramped little shops that smelled of ink and wood smoke. Yet in those faded pages, towns discovered gossip, markets, politics, and the very first sparks of public debate. Every copy mattered, because each issue carried voices that could shape a colony's future. Tonight, we will step quietly into that world, into the dim glow of early printing presses, the cautious words of bold printers, and the rustle of pages that once traveled through hands eager to know more. So settle in. Let your mind drift to the past, and before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these stories alive. Before the earliest American newspapers found their way into the hands of readers, there were already signs that people hungered for something more permanent than rumors and more orderly than tavern talk. Information had always traveled, of course, by ship, by letter, by word of mouth carried along dusty roads, but it was scattered, fleeting, and easily lost. In the colonies of North America, far from the presses of London or Amsterdam, a person might wait weeks for a packet ship to arrive with news from Europe, only to find the stories already old, the battles already fought, the debates already settled. In such a world, the desire for something printed, something fixed, something that could be read aloud and kept for later, grew stronger with each passing year. Coffee houses were one of the earliest stages for this desire. In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, men gathered in these dimly lit rooms where the air was thick with the smell of roasted beans and damp wool coats. A steaming cup on the table, the low murmur of voices all around, the clatter of chairs on uneven floors. These were the sounds of early news exchange. In one corner, a sailor fresh from the docks repeated tales he had heard in London or Barbados. In another, a merchant unfolded a letter and read it aloud to those gathered nearby. Gossip, fact, speculation, and rumor swirled together until the line between them blurred. What mattered was not just what was true, but what was talked about, what was worth repeating. Pamphlets added another layer. They were cheap to produce, only a few pages long, often written in plain language and distributed by hand or through bookshops. A pamphlet could contain a sermon, a political argument, a personal dispute, or even a bit of satire. They were not newspapers, but they carried ideas from one reader to another, sometimes sparking heated discussion, sometimes spreading quietly through the countryside. Colonists read them at tables, copied passages into letters, or nailed them to tavern walls. A single pamphlet could travel far beyond its place of origin, its voice echoing in towns that the author might never see. Letters, too, played a crucial role. Merchants exchanged them constantly, filling pages with reports of prices, cargoes, and markets. Families wrote about births, deaths, and daily struggles. Politicians, ministers, and scholars debated in long correspondences that stretched across the Atlantic. Letters were private, but they often escaped into public view. A letter copied and passed from hand to hand became a kind of proto-news article, carrying its account to a wider audience. In taverns and coffee houses, someone might pull a letter from his pocket, unfold the creased paper, and read it aloud to a group eager for any scrap of knowledge from distant places. All of these, coffeehouse conversations, pamphlets, letters, showed that people were ready for newspapers even before the first issue appeared. What they lacked was a structure, a form that could gather the fragments of news and present them regularly, reliably, in one place. The printing press, with its heavy wooden frame and its carefully carved type, was already present in the colonies. Printers had long produced almanacs, broadsides, sermons, and books. But the idea of a recurring publication devoted to news both foreign and local was something new, something daring. It required not only machinery but also courage, for printed words could be as dangerous as weapons if they angered the wrong people. Consider the printer's shop in those days. It was not a grand office, but a cramped room filled with the smell of ink and the sound of type being set. Wooden cases of tiny metal letters lined the walls, each one waiting to be placed into the composing stick. A journeyman stood at a workbench, arranging words letter by letter, line by line, while the apprentice pumped the press or spread ink with sheepskin balls. Sheets of coarse paper hung from lines to dry, their edges curling in the damp air. Outside, the street bustled with carts, horses, and townsfolk, but inside, the work was meticulous, patient, almost meditative. The press was a machine of repetition, each pull producing a new page. Each page carrying words that could travel farther than the voice that spoke them. It was in this setting that the idea of a newspaper first began to stir. Printers knew there was a hunger for news. They heard it in the questions of customers, in the chatter of the coffee houses, in the requests for letters to be read aloud. They saw it in the way pamphlets circulated, in the way broadsides were torn from walls to be read more closely. What was missing was regularity, a promise that the news would come again, not just once but week after week, issue after issue. This promise required commitment, paper, ink, time, and most of all, the willingness to face authorities who might not welcome such a venture. The colonies were still under British rule, and the Crown kept a close eye on the press. Too much criticism of officials, too much questioning of policies, could bring charges of sedition. Printers could be fined, imprisoned, or silenced. Yet the very risk made newspapers attractive. A sheet of printed news could say things that might be lost in conversation. It could preserve arguments, spread them across distances, and give them a permanence that rumor never had. For readers, this permanence was part of the appeal. To hold a newspaper was to hold a piece of time, a record that could be saved, folded, and read again. Before the first newspapers, the rhythm of information was slow, uncertain. A ship might arrive with letters, a pamphlet might appear suddenly, a rumor might spread for weeks before fading. Newspapers promised a different rhythm, regularity. Even if the issues were thin, even if they contained only a few items of news, their very existence created an expectation. People began to look forward to them, to ask when the next issue would come, to plan their conversations around them. They became part of the calendar, part of the flow of life, in many ways. The earliest newspapers were born from the intersection of two desires, the human craving to know, and the printer's craft that made knowing possible. Coffee houses buzzed with words, pamphlets carried ideas, letters recorded events, but newspapers promised to gather it all together, to bring order to the scattered fragments. They were the next step, a step that would change not only how people learned, but also how they thought of themselves as part of a community. For before a community can act, it must first imagine itself as connected. Newspapers, even in their smallest, most fragile forms, gave colonists that connection. They allowed a farmer in Massachusetts to read the same words as a merchant in New York, a lawyer in Philadelphia, or a planter in Virginia. They allowed people separated by miles of forest and river to share the same stories, the same debates, the same sense of belonging to something larger. This was their quiet power, even before politics gave them sharper edges. And so, before the first issue ever appeared, the stage was already set. The people were ready, the presses were ready, the hunger was ready. All it took was for one printer to gather courage, set the type, ink the fourmi, pull the bar, and release into the world a sheet of paper that would begin a new chapter in colonial life. The earliest American newspapers did not arrive into silence. They arrived into a world already buzzing, already restless, already leaning forward, eager for something more permanent than rumor and more regular than chance. They would be small at first, fragile and easily lost. But their very fragility made them precious. Each copy mattered. Each word mattered, because together they were more than just ink on paper. They were the beginning of a habit, the birth of a public voice, the slow, steady start of a tradition that would grow to shape a nation. Before the steady rhythm of newspapers took hold in colonial America, there was one daring, fragile, and short-lived attempt that set the stage for everything that followed. In September of 1690, in Boston, a printer named Benjamin Harris produced a paper he called Public Occurrences, both for rain and domestic. It was meant to be the first regularly published newspaper in the colonies, a vessel for news that would appear once a month, or more often if events required. The title itself suggested ambition. It promised not only local reports, but also matters from abroad, a mingling of the immediate and the distant. Yet this paper, the very first of its kind, lasted only a single issue before being silenced by authority. The story of Public Occurrences is a story of beginnings, of courage, and of limits. Harris was no stranger to controversy. He had once published in London, where he ran afoul of officials for printing pamphlets that criticized leaders and stirred debates that those in power would have preferred left unspoken. By the time he came to Boston, he was already marked as a man who believed in the press as a tool for public conversation, a man willing to take risks. The colonies, though distant from London, were still firmly under British authority, and the governors of Massachusetts Bay watched closely what was said and printed. Yet Harris pressed on, perhaps sensing that the colonies themselves were hungry for news that was not merely gossip or rumor, but printed words that could be shared, reread, and kept. When the first issue appeared, it was a modest sheet of 4 pages. Its appearance was plain, with text printed in dense columns, the type somewhat uneven, the margins narrow. To hold it was to feel something fragile yet bold, a page that declared with its very existence that America, too, could have a newspaper. Its contents were a mixture that revealed both the printer's ambition and his caution. Reports of foreign wars, copied from European sources, sat beside local news of sickness among native peoples, accounts of a recent fire in Boston, and even a sharp suggestion that certain political leaders were not serving the colony's interests as well as they should. In one corner, a small note remarked upon rumors of immorality in the French court, a detail likely copied from London pamphlets, but nonetheless risky too. Print in a colonial setting, the readers of Boston had never seen anything quite like it. To hold a page that collected multiple items of news in one place, laid out in orderly fashion, was a novelty. They were used to broadsides and pamphlets, to letters read aloud, to gossip in taverns and coffee houses. But here was something that gathered all of that energy into a single sheet. It could be bought, read, folded, kept. It carried an air of permanence, a sense that news might now have a home, a record that would endure beyond the fleeting breath of rumor. For a moment, the colonies seemed poised to join the wider world of print culture that had already taken root in Europe. Yet authority was swift in its response. Within days, the colonial government ordered that Public Occurrences be suppressed. The official reason was that it had been printed without a proper license. No prior permission had been sought, no oversight allowed. The authorities feared that such a paper could spread reflections of a very high nature, stirring unrest or inviting criticism of leaders. The specific contents of Harris's issue, especially the insinuations about political leadership and the moral state of foreign courts, were judged improper. The printers were summoned, the remaining copies suppressed, and orders given that no such publication should appear again without approval. Thus, the first newspaper in America lasted but a single issue. Its life was measured in days, its pages scarce even then, many lost to time. Today, only a few copies survive, fragile relics held in libraries. Their ink faded but still legible, their 4 pages carrying the weight of a beginning that came too soon. And yet, even in its failure, Public Occurrences left a mark. It proved that a newspaper could be made in the colonies, that there were printers with the courage to attempt it, and that there were readers eager to hold it in their hands. It also revealed the dangers. The Crown and its colonial governors would not allow unchecked printing. Newspapers, if they were to survive, would have to tread carefully, balancing the hunger for information with the boundaries of authority. For the ordinary reader of Boston, the suppression was a disappointment. Those who had glimpsed the first issue must have wondered what might have been had it continued. To have news appear regularly, to have matters both foreign and domestic gathered in print, it was a promise quickly snatched away. The silence that followed must have seemed heavier for having been broken. In taverns and coffee houses, people likely spoke of the paper, passed around the surviving copies, and debated why the authorities feared it so much. For if a simple sheet of 4 pages could not be allowed, what did that say about the power of print? Benjamin Harris himself did not remain long in Boston after this. His boldness had cost him dearly, and though he had tried to transplant the spirit of a free press to the colonies, the soil was not yet ready. It would take another 14 years before the next attempt succeeded, when the Boston Newsletter appeared in 1704 under more careful and officially sanctioned circumstances. Yet Harris's effort was not forgotten. Later printers remembered it as the first spark, the beginning that proved the idea possible even if the time was not yet right. To us, looking back, the story of public occurrences is more than a curiosity. It reveals the tensions that would shape American newspapers for generations. The pull between authority and freedom, between caution and boldness, between silence and speech. The colonies were still young, their presses few, their populations small. But the desire to know, to record, to share, that was already strong. Harris's paper, brief though it was, showed that the hunger for news had reached across the Atlantic. That America was ready to begin the long conversation of print. The life of public occurrences was short, but its echo was long. Each time a printer set type for a newspaper in the years that followed. Each time a reader unfolded a sheet in a tavern or a home. Harris's ghost was there, a reminder that the path of newspapers had begun in boldness, in defiance, and in the belief that words on a page mattered. His single issue may have been suppressed, but it could not be erased. For in those 4 fragile pages lay the seed of something far larger, something that would, in time, grow strong enough to withstand both censors and kings. And so, the first attempt was also the first lesson. A newspaper could exist, but it could also be silenced. It could carry news, but it could also carry risk. The press was both a tool and a weapon, both a service and a danger. Harris's public occurrences lived only briefly, but it marked the threshold. Beyond it lay a future in which newspapers would survive, multiply, and one day become the daily bread of public life. But in 1690, in that small Boston print shop, the story was only beginning, its first chapter written, read, and closed almost at once, leaving behind silence, memory, and the promise of more to come. If public occurrences was the spark, then the Boston Newsletter was the first steady flame. It appeared in April of 1704, 14 years after Benjamin Harris's daring but short-lived experiment. Unlike its predecessor, this newspaper endured. It did not vanish after a single issue, nor did it provoke immediate suppression. Instead, it became the first continuously published newspaper in the American colonies, its pages unfolding week after week, year after year, until it stood as proof that newspapers could live and thrive even under watchful authority. The man behind the Boston Newsletter was John Campbell, the postmaster of Boston. His position already placed him at the center of information. Letters passed through his hands, ships' arrivals were reported to him, and he had access to official communications from London and beyond. Campbell saw the steady stream of news that entered the colonies and realized it could be gathered, organized, and printed for others to read. Unlike Harris, whose boldness had brought censure, Campbell approached the idea cautiously. He sought official approval before publishing. The governor and council of Massachusetts Bay gave their consent, provided that the content would remain respectful and free of sedition. And so, with backing from authority, the Boston Newsletter was born. The first issue was modest, a single sheet printed on both sides, its text dense and orderly. It began with reports from Europe, copied from London papers that had arrived by ship. These accounts described battles, treaties, and the movements of kings and armies. For colonists who lived months away from Europe by sea, such news was already old by the time it arrived, but it was still precious. To know what had happened across the ocean, even weeks or months earlier, connected the colonies to the wider world. It gave them a sense of being part of a larger story, of sharing in events that shaped empires. Alongside foreign news, the Boston Newsletter also carried local information. It listed ships that had entered Boston Harbor, their cargoes, and their destinations. Merchants scanned these reports eagerly, for they told of opportunities and risks, of goods arriving or departing, of markets opening or closing. Notices of deaths, public meetings, and government proclamations also appeared, giving the paper a role as both informer and record keeper. Advertisements soon joined, small at first but growing steadily. Notices of auctions, sales of land, and runaway servants or apprentices. Each advertisement told its own story, weaving the fabric of daily life into the newspaper's pages. Campbell's paper was cautious in tone. Unlike Harris, he avoided sharp criticism of authorities or daring commentary. The Boston Newsletter was steady, sober, and reliable, aiming not to provoke but to inform. For this reason, it was tolerated by the colonial government and even supported, for it served as a channel of official communication as well as public information. Its cautiousness ensured its survival, but it also shaped its character. It was not a lively or radical paper, but a careful one, building trust slowly among its readers. The physical appearance of the Boston Newsletter reflected its modest beginnings. The type was uneven, the margins tight, the paper coarse. Yet to its readers, it was remarkable. To hold in one's hands a weekly sheet of news was to hold a rhythm of information that had never before existed in the colonies. Each week brought something new: reports from Europe, updates from neighboring colonies, lists of ships, notices of sales, even the occasional poem or anecdote. It was not only information, but continuity. Readers began to expect the paper, to look for it, to rely upon it as part of their weekly lives. Over time, the Boston Newsletter grew. It expanded in size, added more columns, and carried more advertisements. It became a mirror of colonial society, reflecting both the grand events of Europe and the small happenings of Boston streets. When wars broke out abroad, its pages filled with accounts of battles and treaties. When storms struck New England, it recorded the damage, the loss of ships, the suffering of towns. When ships arrived, it listed their cargoes in careful detail: sugar, molasses, rum, nails, cloth, salt, and countless other goods. To read the newsletter was to see the flow of life itself, moving between continents, between harbors, between people. The audience for the paper was small at first. Literacy was not universal, and newspapers were not cheap. A subscription cost money, and not everyone could afford it. But those who did subscribe often shared their copies widely. A single paper might be read aloud in a tavern, passed among neighbors, or folded carefully and kept in a chest. In this way, the Boston Newsletter reached far beyond its subscribers, spreading its words through communities that might never have seen the printed sheet themselves. The practice of reading aloud turned the newspaper into a social event, binding people together in conversation and debate. As the years passed, the Boston Newsletter became part of the fabric of colonial life. It endured changes in leadership, shifts in political climate, and the challenges of running a newspaper in a distant colony. It trained both printers and readers in the habit of regular news. For printers, it demonstrated that newspapers could be sustained, that advertisements could support them, that authority could be managed. For readers, it created the expectation that news would come regularly, that events both near and far would be recorded, that the world could be known not only through rumor but through ink on paper. The legacy of the Boston newsletter is not found in fiery editorials or daring statements, but in its endurance. It lasted for decades, long enough to inspire imitation, long enough to teach the colonies the value of a steady press. Other newspapers soon followed, in Boston, in New York, in Philadelphia, each one building on the path that Campbell had begun. Together, they created a network of print that connected the colonies, carried ideas, and eventually played a role in the birth of a nation. But it was the Boston newsletter that showed it could be done, that the press could survive, that the newspaper could become a fixture of life in America. Looking back, it may seem a humble beginning, a single sheet, dense with type, cautious in tone, modest in scope. Yet in its quiet persistence lay something revolutionary. For the first time, colonists could count on a regular printed record of their world. They could look at a page and see themselves reflected, their ships, their markets, their events, their lives. They could feel connected to distant lands and neighboring towns alike. And they could trust that next week, another issue would come, and the rhythm would continue. The Boston newsletter was, in its way, like the steady beat of a drum, faint at first, but growing stronger with each strike. It taught colonists to listen for the rhythm of news, to expect it, to rely upon it. And in doing so, it laid the foundation for the vibrant, diverse, and sometimes unruly press that would grow in America in the decades to come. When the Boston newsletter found its rhythm, it did more than inform the people of Massachusetts Bay. It set a precedent. It showed that newspapers could exist in the colonies not as a fragile experiment doomed to suppression, but as a steady, repeatable practice. It proved that readers would pay, that advertisements would sustain, that governors would tolerate, as long as printers remained careful. From Boston, the idea began to travel outward, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Newspapers appeared in other towns, in other colonies, until what had once been a novelty became a feature of American life. The spread began close to Boston, where other printers observed Campbell's example and considered how they might create their own versions. Each colony had its own rhythms, its own needs, its own mixture of merchants, farmers, politicians, and readers. Yet all shared the same hunger, the desire to know more than rumor, to hold words in their hands that could be trusted, reread, and preserved. Printers, always alert to opportunity, realized that a newspaper could supply this hunger while also sustaining their businesses. The press that had once printed sermons, broadsides, and almanacs could just as easily turn to news to be why the early 18th century, the colonies were stretching and growing. Ports were busier, towns larger, trade more constant. Ships carried letters and newspapers back and forth across the Atlantic, and printers copied news from London sheets as soon as they arrived. What had once seemed a daring experiment now seemed almost inevitable. If Boston could support a paper, why not New York? Why not Philadelphia? Why not Charleston? New York's turn came in 1725 with the launch of the New York Gazette. Printed by William Bradford, a veteran printer who had once worked in Philadelphia, this newspaper carried many of the same features as the Boston newsletter. It was cautious, filled with official proclamations, notices, and copied items from London papers. Bradford was no radical. He valued safety over boldness, and his paper reflected that choice. But even in its caution, it mattered. It gave New Yorkers their own sheet of news, their own rhythm of weekly publication. It made the city feel connected not only to Boston and London, but also to itself, as people read the same pages, shared the same words, and responded to the same items. Philadelphia soon followed. In 1728, Samuel Keimer began the Pennsylvania Gazette. It was modest at first, But within a few years, it would pass into the hands of a young printer named Benjamin Franklin, who transformed it into one of the most lively and influential newspapers in the colonies. Franklin's genius lay not only in his skill with type and ink, but in his sense of what readers wanted. He filled the Gazette with essays, satire, commentary, and sharp observations that made it more than a record of events. It became a voice, one that shaped opinion and encouraged debate. Through Franklin, the newspaper ceased to be merely a cautious vessel of information. It became an instrument of thought, a place where ideas as well as events were printed. Other colonies added their voices in turn. In Maryland, in Virginia, in South Carolina, newspapers appeared in the 1730s and 1740s, each one adapting the form to local conditions. In Charleston, the South Carolina Gazette carried news not only of Europe and the northern colonies, but also of the Caribbean, with which the port was closely tied. In Williamsburg, Virginia, the Virginia Gazette recorded both the official proclamations of the colonial government and the bustling life of plantations, markets, and towns. These papers reflected the geography and economy of their colonies, carrying advertisements for slaves in the South, notices of land sales in the frontier, prices of wheat and flour in the middle colonies, shipping reports in the ports. With each new newspaper, the habit of reading and expecting news deepened. Villagers who once relied solely on rumor now listened eagerly when someone unfolded a fresh issue. Merchants compared prices in print with those they heard on the docks. Farmers read about markets beyond their town. Lawyers and politicians studied official notices and debated policies. Even those who could not afford subscriptions encountered newspapers in taverns, where copies were nailed to walls or read aloud to gathered crowds. A single sheet might pass through dozens of hands, its edges softening, its ink fading, until it finally rested in a drawer or chest, saved as a record of a particular week in time. The spread of newspapers also changed how colonies saw one another. A merchant in New York might read of events in Boston. A farmer in Pennsylvania might hear news from Charleston. A planter in Virginia might learn of debates in Philadelphia. Slowly, a sense of connection grew. The colonies, though separated by forests and rivers, began to share a common conversation. The newspapers stitched them together, carrying not only news but also advertisements, essays, letters, and opinions. They created a public space that was not physical but printed, where words themselves linked people across distance. Yet this spread was not without its limits. Authorities still watched closely, and printers remained careful. To criticize too openly was still to risk punishment. Newspapers often avoided bold political commentary, focusing instead on trade, foreign news, and local happenings. But even within these limits, something was changing. The very existence of multiple newspapers meant that readers could compare, could see differences, could begin to expect variety. Competition encouraged printers to seek new material, to print letters, to invite contributions, to make their papers more engaging. Slowly, the cautious monotone of early newspapers gave way to a richer chorus. By the middle of the 18th century, newspapers had spread to nearly every colony. They varied in quality, in boldness, in scope, but together they created a network of print that bound the colonies together. What had begun with the Boston Newsletter in 1704 had, within 50 years, become a fixture of colonial life from New England to the Carolinas. The press was no longer an experiment. It was an institution. Looking back, the spread of newspapers beyond Boston can be seen as one of the quiet revolutions of the 18th century. It did not announce itself with battles or proclamations. It moved slowly, issue by issue, press by press, until suddenly it was everywhere. It changed how people thought of themselves, how they imagined their neighbors, how they understood their place in the world. It gave them a common language of print, a rhythm of news that echoed from one colony to another. And in time, It would give them the tools to imagine not only themselves as separate colonies, but as a single people with a shared destiny. The spread was, in its essence, the flowering of a seed planted in Boston. What had seemed fragile became sturdy. What had seemed daring became ordinary. What had seemed dangerous became necessary. Newspapers were no longer a novelty. They were part of daily life. And once the habit was formed, once the colonies had tasted the rhythm of print, there would be no turning back. The early American newspaper did not exist in isolation. It was part of a web, fragile, uneven, but steadily growing, that linked printers' shops, post offices, ships, writers, and readers into a network of communication. To understand these first papers, one must look beyond the printed sheets themselves and into the lives of those who produced them, carried them, and kept them moving. Printers and postmasters, in particular, were the quiet architects of this web. They turned scattered scraps of information into something resembling a public conversation. And though their names are not always remembered, their hands shaped the rhythm of news in the colonies. The printer was at the heart of it all. His shop was a small world of wood and metal, paper and ink, noise and patience. To step inside was to hear the squeak of the press, the thump of the platen, the steady clatter of type being set. Cases of letters sat ready, each one a small compartment holding the alphabet in rows, uppercase in one box, lowercase in another. Compositors stood before these cases, selecting letters one at a time, arranging them in lines upon a composing stick, sliding them together into words, then sentences, then columns. The work was slow, demanding, and filled with the possibility of error. A letter misplaced could ruin a word. A line uneven could spoil a page. Yet day after day, the printer and his journeyman performed this labor, shaping news out of lead and patience. Ink was prepared in heavy pots, thick and sticky, with a smell sharp and persistent. It was spread onto sheepskin balls, padded with wool, and then dabbed carefully across the surface of the type. Sheets of paper, often coarse and rough-edged, were laid in place, pressed by the great wooden screw of the press, and lifted again with words now stamped upon them. Each pull of the press produced a single impression. 50, 100, 200, each sheet handled by hand, each one a small miracle of reproduction. It was repetitive, but it was also transformative, scraps of lead and ink becoming pages that could be read by dozens, by hundreds, by thousands. But printers were more than mechanics. They were also editors, merchants, and negotiators. They decided what news to include, what letters to reprint, what advertisements to accept. They balanced the desires of readers with the caution demanded by authorities. They sought material constantly, scouring incoming letters, copying from London papers, listening in taverns, reading pamphlets. They relied on travelers and sailors, on merchants and ministers, on anyone who might bring them a scrap of information. A printer's shop was not only a workshop, but also a crossroads, where the flow of words from many places came together, sorted and shaped into something new. Postmasters, meanwhile, provided the arteries of this network. In many colonies, the printer and the postmaster were one and the same. John Campbell, the publisher of the Boston Newsletter, was also Boston's postmaster, and it was through his position that he had access to the letters and reports that filled his paper. The post office was where ships delivered packets of news from London, where riders brought letters from neighboring towns, where merchants left notices to be sent on to distant partners. By holding this position, a printer had early access to information, and he could choose what to print, what to hold, what to circulate privately. The post office was thus both a source of news and a means of distribution. The postal riders themselves were part of this story. They traveled long, difficult routes, often through mud, snow, or storm, carrying bags heavy with letters and newspapers. They stopped at taverns and inns, exchanged packets with other riders, and kept the fragile chain of communication intact. To the villagers who saw them pass, they were symbols of connection, reminders that the world beyond the forest and the fields was not unreachable. When they carried newspapers, they carried more than ink on paper. They carried the sense that communities were linked, that events in Boston or New York could matter in Philadelphia or Williamsburg. Ships, too, were vital. Every transatlantic packet brought London papers, sometimes weeks old but still treasured. Printers copied freely from these sources, reprinting stories of European wars, debates in Parliament, markets in London, fires in Paris, earthquakes in distant lands. Such news might seem remote, but it gave colonists a sense of belonging to a larger world. The arrival of a ship with London papers could fill the next issue, and readers eagerly scanned the pages for glimpses of the world beyond their own shores. The sea carried not only goods and people, but also news, binding the colonies to Europe with a fragile but steady stream of words. Advertisements formed another thread in this web. Merchants and shopkeepers paid to list their goods, their auctions, their lost items. Notices of runaway servants or enslaved people appeared alongside offers for land or apprenticeships. These ads provided income for the printer, helping to sustain the newspaper, but they also provided information for readers. To scan the advertisements was to glimpse the life of the colony, its commerce, its conflicts, its opportunities, its losses. They were as much news as the reports from Europe, and they gave the paper its texture, its grounding in daily life. Readers themselves were part of the web. A newspaper was not consumed silently and alone, but shared. A single copy might be read aloud in a tavern, passed from hand to hand in a family, or borrowed by a neighbor. Margins carried notes, words underlined by readers eager to remember, sometimes even disputes written in the blank spaces. Newspapers circulated widely beyond their official subscribers, carried by riders, folded into letters, or slipped into trunks for journeys. They were living objects, worn and softened by use, absorbed into the fabric of everyday life. This web of printers, postmasters, writers, ships, advertisements, and readers was fragile. Storms delayed ships, roads washed out, presses broke, paper ran short, ink spoiled. At times, issues were skipped, or news arrived stale, or errors crept into type. Yet for all its fragility, the web held. Week after week, papers appeared. Towns expected them. Merchants relied on them. Conversations turned on them. The imperfections did not weaken the habit. If anything, they made it more cherished. To receive a newspaper was to feel connected, even when the news was old or the printing uneven. It was the presence of the paper itself, more than the perfection of its content, that mattered. Through this web, the colonies slowly became more than isolated settlements. They became a community of readers, listeners, and talkers bound by the rhythm of print. Printers and postmasters did not set out to create a public sphere, but in serving their trades and their towns, they built one. They stitched together fragments of information into something that could be shared, something that could endure. They gave the colonies not only news, but also the habit of expecting news. The confidence that events mattered, the sense that words could travel and connect, and so, in the quiet labor of printers hunched over typecases, in the steady work of postmasters sorting letters, in the long rides of couriers, in the sails of ships filled with papers from abroad, a web of information spread across the colonies. It was fragile, imperfect, often delayed, but it was there. It was strong enough to carry news, strong enough to carry ideas, and in time, strong enough to carry the weight of a revolution. But in its beginnings, it was simply the daily labor of ordinary men with ink-stained hands and weary horses, stitching together the first fabric of America's press. When we think of early American newspapers, it is tempting to imagine them being quietly read by candlelight at a desk, folded neatly and stored in drawers for safekeeping. Yet the life of news was far more communal, far more social than the solitary image suggests. A newspaper in the 18th century colonies did not belong to just one person. It belonged to many. It was read aloud, argued over, passed from hand to hand, nailed to tavern walls, carried into coffee houses, and discussed in marketplaces. It was a living object, one that traveled far beyond the press and the subscriber's table. To understand the power of these earliest newspapers, we must step into the places where they were read and heard, and into the ways they created conversations that reached every corner of colonial society. The tavern was perhaps the most important stage for this communal life of news. Taverns stood at the center of towns, their signs creaking in the wind, their rooms filled with the smell of ale, roasting meat, wood smoke, and damp wool. Travelers, merchants, sailors, and townsfolk gathered there not only for food and drink, but for company, for information, for connection. A fresh newspaper, unfolded on a tavern table, was a magnet. Men clustered around as someone read aloud, his voice rising above the clatter of mugs and the hum of talk. Reports of European wars, copied from London papers, drew murmurs of interest. Notices of ships arriving with cargo stirred merchants to calculation. Advertisements of auctions or sales drew nods from farmers and shopkeepers. And when a sharp phrase hinted at criticism of officials, voices grew louder, debates broke out, and the tavern filled with argument. Reading aloud was crucial, for literacy was uneven. Not everyone could read with ease, but almost everyone could listen. A single reader could therefore turn a newspaper into a performance, bringing its words to life for a gathered audience. The cadence of the reader's voice, the pauses, the emphases, shaped how the news was received. A dry notice could sound urgent when read with feeling. A cautious report could spark laughter when delivered with irony. In this way, newspapers were not only printed texts but spoken events. Living conversations carried by voices in crowded rooms. Coffee houses played a similar role, especially in larger towns like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. These were places where merchants and professionals gathered, their tables cluttered with cups, letters, and newspapers. Unlike the rougher taverns, coffee houses carried an air of business and debate. Here, newspapers were read carefully, compared with letters from abroad, and discussed with a seriousness that reflected the ambitions of those who met there. A merchant might read aloud a shipping list, while others scribbled notes. A lawyer might point to a notice of a court decision and begin a debate about precedent. Coffee houses were hubs of exchange, where newspapers flowed as freely as the dark, steaming drink in the cups that in homes. Newspapers had their own life. A father might read aloud to his family by firelight, his children listening wide-eyed to reports of distant lands, his wife noting advertisements for goods or services. The paper might be folded carefully and set aside, then read again the next day, or passed to a neighbor. In rural areas, where newspapers arrived more slowly, a single copy could circulate among several households, read until its paper softened and its ink blurred. Margins filled with notes, names underlined, passages marked. The newspaper was not simply consumed. It was used, shared, and integrated into daily life. Advertisements gave newspapers an especially practical role. Notices of auctions, sales of land, offers of goods, and announcements of lost animals or runaway apprentices filled the columns. Readers scanned these closely, sometimes more eagerly than the news itself. A farmer might note the sale of tools, a widow might mark a notice for a new household servant, a shopkeeper might eye the arrival of goods he could not otherwise find. These advertisements made the newspaper not only a source of information, but also a marketplace in print, a guide to opportunities and transactions. They gave the paper its connection to the practical concerns of life, grounding lofty foreign reports in the realities of the colony. The social life of news also extended to the street. Printers' apprentices sometimes read headlines aloud as they carried bundles through town. Sheets were posted in public places, nailed to posts or doors, where passers-by stopped to read or listen. In marketplaces, men and women discussed the latest issue, repeating what they had heard, embellishing details, spreading the words further still. News did not stay confined to the page. It moved through voices, gestures, and conversations until it became part of the shared awareness of the community. The role of the newspaper in taverns and coffee houses cannot be overstated. These were the places where ideas began to circulate, where private thoughts became public conversations, where scattered individuals discovered themselves as part of a community. A single report in a newspaper could set tongues wagging for days, could shape the tone of debates, could linger in memory long after the paper itself had been folded and put away. The tavern table, the coffeehouse bench, the family hearth, these were the true arenas of the early press, where ink met voice and voice met ear, and ear turned again to voice. This communal life of newspapers also meant that they reached far beyond their official subscribers. A printer might have only a few hundred paying readers, but each copy of a paper might be read by dozens more. The true audience of early newspapers was therefore many times larger than the subscription lists suggest. In taverns, a single copy might serve an entire town. In rural villages, one newspaper carried along muddy roads might pass through 10 households. In coffee houses, copies lay on tables, open to any who entered. The life of a newspaper was long and varied, its words traveling farther than its printer could have imagined. For those who listened, the experience of news was as much about company as content. To gather around a reader, to share reactions, to argue, to laugh. These were social acts, ways of building bonds and identities. The newspaper became a tool not only of knowledge, but of belonging. It told people not only what had happened, but also that they were part of a world in which such things mattered. It gave them a sense of connection to their town, their colony, and eventually to the other colonies as well. The social life of newspapers was, in its quiet way, revolutionary. It took scattered individuals and turned them into publics, groups bound together by shared words and shared conversations. It prepared the ground for political debate, for collective action, for the eventual idea that people separated by distance could nonetheless act together. But in its beginnings, it was simpler, a group of men in a tavern, mugs in hand, leaning over a single sheet of coarse paper as a voice read aloud the news of the week. The taverns and coffee houses, the homes and streets, were where newspapers truly lived. The printer's press gave them form, but it was in these places that they breathed, that they found their audience, that they became more than ink. Here, in the clatter of mugs, the murmur of voices, the glow of candles, the rustle of paper, the early American newspaper became part of daily life, part of community, part of the rhythm of survival and belonging. When readers in colonial America unfolded a newspaper, they did not simply encounter reports of distant wars or proclamations from governors. They encountered reflections of themselves. The newspaper, even in its simplest form, was a mirror, uneven, sometimes distorted, sometimes incomplete, but nonetheless a mirror of daily life. It captured the rhythms of commerce, the struggles of households, the anxieties of towns, the aspirations of individuals. To read its pages was to see the texture of life as it was lived, week by week, in markets, homes, fields, and Harbor's Point. One of the clearest reflections came through advertisements. These were not mere filler. They were windows into the everyday concerns of colonists. Notices of goods for sale told of what was valued, what was scarce, what was newly arrived from across the ocean. A farmer seeking to sell livestock, a merchant announcing imported cloth, a widow offering furniture at auction. Each advertisement was a fragment of life, a glimpse into transactions that shaped survival. To read them was to trace the economy in miniature, to see what was moving through towns and into households. Runaway notices were another stark reflection. Apprentices who fled their masters, servants who sought freedom, enslaved people who escaped captivity. Their names, descriptions, and rewards filled column after column. These notices revealed both the harshness of colonial labor systems and the yearning of individuals to break free. For readers, they were reminders of the tensions beneath daily life, the fragility of order, the persistence of resistance. Each runaway advertisement told a story, not only of loss for the master, but of courage for the one who fled. Legal notices appeared as well, announcements of estates being settled, debts to be paid, courts convening. These were the paper trails of ordinary disputes and arrangements, the legal framework that underpinned society. Readers saw in them the reminders of mortality, of obligation, of the need to reckon with property and responsibility. They were the small but constant presence of the law, woven into the fabric of print. Weather reports were rare, but when storms struck or fires consumed buildings, newspapers recorded the damage. Accounts of ships wrecked along coasts, of barns burned by lightning, of floods sweeping fields appeared in their pages. These reports reflected the vulnerability of colonial life, the precariousness of survival in a world where natural forces could undo months of labor in an instant. They gave readers not only information but a sense of solidarity. Others, too, had suffered loss. Others, too, had endured disaster. Deaths and births, though not always listed systematically, found their way into newspapers through notices and advertisements. A prominent figure's passing was recorded in solemn prose. A child's death might be noted in a family's notice of thanks. These were the tender edges of daily life, glimpsed in the columns of print. They reminded readers that newspapers were not only about politics or commerce, but also about the fragile cycles of human existence. Markets and shipping lists provided another mirror. The arrival of ships was detailed with precision. The vessel's name, its captain, its cargo, its destination. These lists were practical tools for merchants, but for readers they were also signals of the flow of life between colonies and across the ocean. To read of sugar from the Caribbean, molasses from Barbados, cloth from London, or nails from Philadelphia was to glimpse the arteries of trade that fed colonial towns. The newspaper thus reflected the interconnectedness of the world, the way local life depended on distant markets and unseen hands. Letters and essays, often reprinted from London papers, also shaped this mirror. Though foreign in origin, they reflected the intellectual diet of the colonies, the kinds of arguments and ideas that circulated among readers. Essays on morality, stories of scientific discoveries, accounts of strange events in Europe or Asia. All of these filled the pages and gave readers a sense of belonging to a wider conversation. The newspaper did not only mirror what was near, it extended vision outward, showing colonists that their lives were connected to distant places and debates. Even the physical paper itself was part of the mirror. The coarse texture, the uneven ink, the misaligned letters, all bore traces of the printer's hand, the limitations of resources, the improvisation of colonial life. A smudge of ink, a misspelled word, a page printed faintly on one side were not flaws alone, but reminders of the conditions under which newspapers were made. They mirrored the roughness and resourcefulness of colonial existence, where perfection was rare, but persistence was constant. What is striking, when one reads these early newspapers, is how little distinction there was between the extraordinary and the ordinary. A report of a European battle might sit beside an advertisement for lost cattle. A proclamation from a governor might be followed by a notice of a runaway apprentice. A description of an earthquake in Italy might share a page with a sale of household goods. To modernize, this seems incongruous. But for readers then, it was natural. Life itself was such a mixture. The grand and the small, the distant and the near, the dramatic and the mundane. The newspaper mirrored that mixture, offering readers a weekly slice of life as it unfolded. This quality made newspapers precious. They were not simply chronicles of power, but chronicles of life. They captured the details that letters might overlook, that gossip might distort, that memory might lose. They froze them in ink, week after week, until they became a record. For historians, they are treasures. For readers, then, they were tools, guides, and mirrors. Newspapers also reflected the inequalities of their world. The voices that appeared in their columns were often those of merchants, officials, and elites. Women appeared more often in advertisements than in essays. The poor were more often subjects of notices than authors of letters. Enslaved people appeared in runaway ads, their humanity reduced to descriptions of scars, clothing, and skills. These silences and distortions were part of the mirror too, not because they represented truth, but because they revealed the structures of society, the limits of who could speak and who was silenced. To read these papers is to see not only what was said, but what was missing, what was left unsaid, what remained invisible. And yet, despite these limitations, newspapers were a democratizing force in their way. A man who could not afford a library could still hear news in a tavern. A farmer far from town could still catch sight of a paper carried by a traveler. A laborer who could not write his own letters could still listen to a reader proclaim the latest reports. The newspaper's mirror was imperfect, but it reflected enough that people could see themselves, their communities, their connections. As weeks turned into years, these reflections accumulated. Newspapers became archives of life, storing memories that otherwise would have vanished. To leaf through their pages today is to walk through a colonial town, to hear its gossip, to see its markets, to feel its worries, to glimpse its hopes. It is to recognize that daily life, with all its small details, was the foundation upon which larger events would later stand. The colonists may not have thought of their newspapers as mirrors, but they used them as such. They looked into their pages and saw not only what had happened, but who they were, where they lived, how they belonged. The mirror was not always flattering, not always fair, but it was theirs. And in the quiet turning of pages, in the murmurs of taverns, in the arguments of coffee houses, that mirror helped shape the identity of a people still discovering themselves. In the earliest colonial newspapers, politics was rarely shouted from the front page. The printers, cautious of authority and aware of the risks, avoided bold declarations or fiery manifestos. And yet, politics seeped through the columns all the same. It was present in the choice of stories copied from London, in the phrasing of official proclamations, in the silences as much as the words. To read these newspapers was to engage in a quiet game of interpretation, where meaning often lived not in what was stated plainly, but in what was hinted, implied, or left unsaid. Politics lived between the lines. Colonial printers walked a narrow path. On one side stood the authorities, governors, councils, and ultimately the crown, who demanded respect, obedience, and restraint. On the other side stood their readers, merchants, farmers, ministers, lawyers, and ordinary townsfolk, who craved information, who wanted to know not only what had happened, but what it might mean. A printer who leaned too far toward boldness risked censure or punishment. One who leaned too far toward caution risked losing his readers' trust. The dance between these pressures shaped the political character of early newspapers. Foreign news provided one avenue. Reports from Europe, copied from London papers, filled the early pages. These accounts of wars, treaties, and parliamentary debates might seem distant, but colonists read them closely, searching for hints of how imperial policies might affect their lives. A battle between England and France was not just a faraway clash. It meant disruptions in trade, dangers for ships at sea, and changes in taxes. By printing these reports, printers offered colonists a window into the decisions of empire, even if they dared not comment openly on their meaning. The very act of choosing which foreign stories to reprint carried weight. for it suggested what the printer believed his readers needed or wanted to know. Official proclamations carried another layer of politics. Governors used newspapers to announce new regulations, to call for public days of fasting or Thanksgiving, to warn of dangers or celebrate victories. These notices, printed without alteration, reflected the authority of the crown in the colonies. But readers did not always accept them passively. A proclamation calling for higher taxes or tighter controls might be read with mutters of discontent in taverns and homes. A notice of war might stir both loyalty and anxiety. The printer, by placing such proclamations on the page, became a mediator between rulers and ruled, presenting authority while knowing that readers might interpret it in their own way. Advertisements, too, carried political weight. Notices for land sales revealed patterns of settlement, expansion, and displacement. Announcements of runaway apprentices and enslaved people reflected the tensions of labor systems. Sales of imported goods highlighted colonial dependence on overseas markets. Each advertisement was a fragment of daily politics, not in the grand sense of councils and parliaments, but in the lived reality of power, property, and survival. To read them was to glimpse the structures of society, the inequalities, the aspirations, the conflicts beneath the surface. Letters to the editor, when they appeared, provided another opening. Some were earnest debates on morality or commerce. Others were sly critiques wrapped in satire. These letters allowed readers to see that newspapers could be more than mirrors of daily life. They could be forums, however cautious, for opinion. Printers often prefaced such letters with disclaimers, insisting that the views were not their own, but the very act of printing them brought those opinions into circulation. Readers, in turn, learned to read between the lines, to recognize irony, to sense when a phrase meant more than it seemed. Silence, too, was political. What was not printed could be as telling as what was. Printers avoided direct criticism of governors or the crown, knowing the risks. Yet readers noticed absences. A rumor spreading in taverns, but absent from the paper, suggested censorship. A sudden shift in tone suggested pressure from above. The gaps became part of the reading experience, as colonists learned to interpret not only the words but the choices behind them. As the 18th century progressed, politics seeped more openly into newspapers. Conflicts between colonies and governors, disputes over trade, and tensions with native nations appeared in cautious reports. Printers copied items from other colonial papers, creating a web of political conversation that stretched from New England to the Carolinas. In Philadelphia, Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette added sharp essays and satire, inviting readers to think critically about authority. In New York, disputes between factions sometimes spilled onto the printed page, each side using newspapers to air its arguments. Slowly, the cautious monotone gave way to a more varied chorus, one in which politics could no longer be entirely hidden between the lines. But even then, subtlety remained. A single word, a choice of placement, a headline phrased one way instead of another, all could carry political meaning. Readers became skilled at detecting these nuances. They learned to read beyond the surface, to hear the undercurrents of power in the arrangement of text. Newspapers taught them not only information but interpretation, a habit of mind that would prove crucial in the decades to come. The politics between the lines was not only about authority and resistance. It was also about identity. By reading newspapers, colonists began to imagine themselves as part of a shared public. They saw that their concerns were echoed in other towns, that their struggles were part of a larger pattern. They began to think of themselves not only as subjects of the crown, but as participants in a conversation that stretched across colonies. Newspapers gave them that conversation, even when the words were cautious, even when the politics had to be read between the lines. The taverns and coffee houses amplified this effect. A proclamation printed in sober type might be read aloud with sarcasm in a crowded room. A report from London might be debated heatedly among merchants and sailors. A letter signed with a pseudonym might spark speculation about its author. The social life of news gave politics its energy, transforming careful print into lively debate. In this way, early American newspapers were political even when they seemed apolitical. Their cautious tone, their dense columns of reprinted news, their advertisements and notices, all were woven into the fabric of power and interpretation. They taught readers to connect events, to sense meaning in silence, to recognize themselves as part of a wider world. Between the lines, in the spaces where words met interpretation, politics took root. And so, long before the fiery rhetoric of revolution, before the pamphlets of protest, before the declarations and speeches, newspapers were already training readers in the habits of politics. They were teaching them to read critically, to question, to debate, to imagine. The politics between the lines was quiet, but it was powerful. It created not only an informed public, but a public capable of seeing beyond the surface, of sensing the hidden currents beneath the printed words. The earliest colonial newspapers were cautious voices. They carried proclamations from governors, copied foreign reports from London sheets, and filled their columns with advertisements that paid the bills. They reflected the authority of the crown and avoided open confrontation. Yet beneath their cautious ink, change was stirring. Over the course of the 18th century, as tensions between colonies and empire grew, newspapers slowly transformed from instruments of loyalism into platforms of dissent. They did not leap suddenly into rebellion, but shifted gradually, issue by issue, phrase by phrase, until the colonies that once read news under the shadow of royal power found themselves reading arguments for resistance, independence, and self-determination. At the beginning of the century, newspapers still leaned heavily toward loyalism. The crown was distant, but it was respected, and colonists thought of themselves as English subjects. Governors relied on printers to publish proclamations, laws, and official days of fasting or Thanksgiving. To print such items was to serve authority, to remind readers of their obligations to king and colony alike. Foreign news, copied from London, reinforced this identity. Colonists saw themselves as participants in the empire's struggles, wars against France, treaties signed in Europe, markets shifting in London. The colonies were small, fragile, and dependent. Newspapers reflected this dependency, carefully staying within boundaries. But as the century unfolded, circumstances began to change. Wars drew the colonies more deeply into imperial affairs. The War of Jenkins' Ear, King George's War, the French and Indian War. Each conflict brought taxes, troops, disruptions of trade, and sacrifices of life. Newspapers reported these events, often with pride in colonial contributions, but also with unease. Readers saw how distant decisions shaped their daily lives. A treaty signed in Europe might alter the price of sugar in Boston. A tax imposed in London might burden merchants in New York. A war fought in the wilderness might cost the lives of neighbors. The more these connections were printed, the more colonists recognized that their fortunes were tied to decisions made across the ocean, decisions in which they had little say. Economic pressures further stirred dissent. Notices of trade restrictions, shipping disruptions, and customs regulations filled advertisements and reports. Merchants complained in letters. Farmers grumbled in taverns. Newspapers, even when cautious, could not avoid printing these realities. A list of ships detained, a notice of goods taxed, an advertisement lamenting shortages, all spoke to the ways imperial policy constrained colonial life. Readers did not need fiery editorials to feel the weight of these words. The facts themselves carried a quiet argument. By mid-century, the tone of some newspapers began to shift. Printers like Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia understood that readers wanted more than proclamations. They wanted commentary, satire, and ideas. Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette offered essays that poked at authority, humor that exposed folly, and reflections that encouraged colonists to think critically about their world. He wrapped his arguments in wit, masking dissent in entertainment, but the effect was real. Readers learned to laugh at power, to see through its pretensions, to recognize its limits. The newspaper had begun to move beyond loyalism, offering space for skepticism. The Stamp Act crisis of 1765 accelerated this transformation. When Parliament imposed a tax on printed materials, including newspapers, it struck at the very heart of colonial print culture. Printers responded with fury. Their newspapers became arenas of protest, publishing essays, resolutions, and accounts of resistance. What had once been cautious sheets now carried bold declarations. Printers who had once avoided politics now found themselves at the center of it, their presses symbols of liberty under threat. Readers who had once looked to newspapers for shipping lists and proclamations now saw them as instruments of defense, voices of the colonies against imperial overreach. The Stamp Act was repealed, but its legacy remained. Newspapers had discovered their power as political actors. From that point forward, dissent spread steadily. Newspapers carried accounts of boycotts, protests, and clashes. They published essays under pseudonyms, their authors debating liberty, rights, and obligations. They copied material from one colony to another, spreading arguments until they echoed across the continent. A letter written in Boston might appear in Philadelphia, then in New York, then in Charleston, carried along the chain of newspapers that reprinted each other's words. The colonies, once isolated, now shared a common political language, a common set of grievances, a common sense of identity. Newspapers were the threads that wove this fabric. Not every printer embraced dissent. Some remained loyal, their papers filled with defenses of the crown and warnings against rebellion. The New York Gazetteer, for instance, supported loyalist views well into the 1770s, and its pages reflected the deep divisions among colonists. Newspapers became battlegrounds, with loyalist and patriot papers offering competing visions. Readers could choose their allegiances not only in taverns and assemblies, but in the very words they unfolded each week. The diversity of voices revealed that dissent was not universal, but contested, debated, and fought over in print. For readers, this transformation was profound. The newspaper that once reflected daily life now shaped it. To read of protests in one town was to imagine them in another. To encounter arguments for liberty was to consider one's own rights. To see loyalist and patriot voices side by side was to recognize that the colonies were divided, but also that they were engaged in a shared debate. Newspapers became schools of politics, training readers not only in information but in argument, persuasion, and collective identity. By the eve of revolution, the shift was complete. Newspapers were no longer cautious mirrors of colonial life under the crown. They were engines of dissent, amplifying voices that called for resistance. They carried the resolutions of assemblies, the essays of pamphleteers, the reports of clashes at Lexington and Concord. They made the revolution imaginable by making it readable, by turning scattered acts into a shared story. In their columns, colonists found not only news but a vision of themselves as a people capable of standing apart, of speaking back, of declaring independence. This journey from loyalism to dissent was not smooth or inevitable. It was contested, uneven, fragile. But it happened in print, in the slow accumulation of words, in the weekly rhythm of news that taught colonists to see, to compare, to question, to argue. It happened between the lines, in the choice of what to print and what to omit, in the tone of essays, in the placement of stories. It happened because newspapers were not only mirrors but also makers of life, shaping how people understood themselves and their world. The changing world of the 18th century demanded this shift. Empires rose and fell, wars disrupted trade, taxes burdened households, protests spread through towns. Newspapers could not remain silent. Their very survival required them to reflect these changes. In doing so, they transformed themselves and their readers with them. From loyalism to dissent, from obedience to questioning, from subjects to citizens, the path was long, but it was walked in part through the pages of colonial newspapers. As the last candle flickers low and the echo of old printing presses fades into silence, we are left with the fragile but enduring legacy of the earliest American newspapers. They began as small sheets, cautious and uneven, often filled with copied reports from across the ocean, advertisements for everyday goods, and official proclamations that reminded colonists of their place under the crown. And yet, week by week, issue by issue, they became something greater. They grew into mirrors of daily life, forums of debate, carriers of rumor, recorders of tragedy, and, finally, voices of dissent, from taverns and coffee houses to family hearths. Newspapers stitched together a scattered people into a community of readers and listeners. They gave colonists not only news of the world, but also a sense of belonging to something larger than their towns and farms. They taught them to read between the lines, to notice what was said and what was missing, to expect that information would arrive again, regularly, like the tide. In doing so, newspapers quietly trained a generation to think, to compare, to question habits that would one day fuel revolution. Even in their imperfections, the smudged ink, the misaligned type, the cautious tone, newspapers carried something lasting. They carried memory. They preserved the laughter of satire, the sorrow of death notices, the arguments of letters, the courage of runaway ads. They held, in their fragile pages, the beginnings of a public life that would grow into a nation's story. And now, as you drift toward rest, imagine those coarse sheets of paper, unfolded in a dim tavern or read aloud by firelight. Their words weaving people together across miles and years. The presses have long since fallen silent, but their echoes remain. They remind us that even the quietest voices, printed on the humblest paper, can carry forward, shaping lives far beyond their time. So close your eyes. Let the rhythm of that history settle gently. And remember, the story of newspapers is not only ink on paper, but the story of connection, of voices reaching out across distance, of a people slowly discovering themselves. And in that calm unfolding, you may find your own rest as the past whispers softly into the night.